Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this Inside Housing and Wink House webinar about the new building safety regulatory regime and specifically what compliance data needs to be submitted to the regulator in October, which is now a mere 3 days away. I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on the call this, but the changes which are going to come into force first in October and then in April are enormous. They affect so much about the way we're going to manage our high-rise buildings and the way we're going to construct them going forward. It's enormously complicated legislation. I think I read somewhere recently that it's 250 pages of law and 400 pages of supplementary documents, and that's not including all of the guidance and various instruments that are out there. That is creating an environment which is extraordinarily difficult to pick through clearly, even for organizations who are expert in these areas and used to doing this sort of thing. There's also a morass of other responsibilities that are coming in. There hasn't been an awful lot of time to prepare compared to the size of the regime, and guidance has sometimes been a little bit difficult to get, to put it mildly. So we're here today to hear from some experts who can hopefully provide some clarity. We're also going to have a good opportunity to take questions from the audience, and I'd really encourage you to use that time to ask the questions you need to ask to understand how this regime is going to work and what you need to be doing as individuals and organizations to comply with the new rules. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, and we do have a terrific panel today. But first, we're going to do a quick poll just to set the scene. My colleague is going to put it live now, and we're going to see what the responses from the audience are like. Just asking whether or not you have submitted the compliance data you need to submit to the regulator as it stands today. So if my colleague presses the magic button, you should see this poll appearing on your screen imminently. All right. Thank you for responding to that poll. So I've got the answers on my screen here. Yes, already done is 17.9% of you on the call. Almost is 26.1% of you. No is 14.2%. And I don't know is 41.8%. And perhaps that's to do with how we phrased the question, but certainly it shows that there's an air of confusion and an air of difficulty around this topic, which hopefully by the end of this hour we can help at least in a small way to work through. So my speakers, I'm very pleased to be joined by Amanda Stubbs from Charles and Hamlins, Mark Alton from our sponsor Wink House, and Stephanie Kelly from 13 Group. Unfortunately, Daniel Boardman, who's head of building safety at St Ledger Homes, has had some unavoidable circumstances, which mean he's not able to join us today. But that does give us more time for question and answer sessions, which I think will be very, very valuable today. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers in more detail before you hear from them. And please, we only have Mark today using slides. Those slides will be available to you at the end of this presentation. So rest assured, you'll get a copy of them. But our first speaker is Amanda Stubbs. Amanda Stubbs is a partner at Trowers and Hamlins. She has more than 30 years experience in the real estate sector. She has considerable regulatory law experience, advises on compliance issues, how to deal with statutory notices, regulatory investigations, and even interviews under caution, which hopefully no one on this call will need her for. But she also regularly provides training for boards and senior management teams about managing health, safety and environmental risks and their responsibilities, both as individuals and as part of their wider organisation. We're going to be hearing from Amanda about the new bill, what to expect from the new regulator, and what might happen legally if the deadlines in the law are not met. So without further ado, I will hand over to Amanda. I'm so sorry. I think Amanda's having some technical difficulties. I've just seen on the chat. So I will move on from Amanda. We will still hear from her, but I'm going to move through to Mark instead. Mark is the fire product manager at Wink House. Wink House UK, for those of you who don't know, a fire safety specialist responsible for the Wink House Evidence Bank of fire, smoke and security test evidence, with a partner network of more than 50 third-party accredited fire door set fabricators. Mark has more than 15 years experience in fire safety, extensive knowledge of fire door set testing and accreditation and legislation. He sits on several current fire standards committees, and he has a significant role in advising specifiers about how to create their own compliance specifications. So Mark is going to talk to us more about the new bill and in more detail also about the fire testing, fire door testing and inspection regime, which obviously is not in this legislation, but follows similar timescales, and people on this call will obviously have questions about that. He's going to offer us a checklist to landlords to help them better understand what they need to file in October. So, Mark, I will hand over to you without any further ado.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Peter. Appreciate that. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. I want to just run through the new legislation. Obviously, we're talking about phase 3 following Grenfell, and why we are where we are, and what it might mean to the landlord or their appointed responsible persons. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So this is just a hierarchy of change. So we've got a listed here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but obviously we're talking about Article 156 of the Building Safety Act. So this has been put in place as a result of improvements by Dame Judith Hackett, and also all of the consultation following the Fire Safety Act, both 2021 and 2022, and also the Fire Safety Order. So this is an accumulation of a lot of work, consultation, looking at what changes do need to be put in place, bridging any gaps or any holes where we were originally, with a view of looking at how we improve our buildings in the UK. Next slide, please. So there are mainly, the key for phase 3 really is to do with this the Building Safety Act and where we are. So it talks about additional duty holders and various other aspects, but mainly we want to focus on the landlord and what their key responsibilities really are for today. So without further ado, can we go on to the next slide, please? So time frame. Initially, this first came out in April of this year, and the actions are required by the 30th of September, so the 1st of October, which is in all reality no time at all for people to make all the work that they've got to do, any actions that they need to input. Difficult one, this, because there are so many different buildings out there, and what does this really relate to? So mainly this particular part relates to what's referred to as a high risk building. So we're talking about buildings of 18 meters and taller. So it's only a segment, and it may affect some people or some landlords. It not necessarily affect all landlords. Next slide, please. The main focus that is there is the accountable person, or we're all very familiar with what a responsible person was, but under law, the responsible person has a level of accountability. We all understand that accountability is different to responsibility, but the key things that they talked about, or what's in legislation, is the responsible person or accountable person, they must have a permanent UK address, even if they're a non-domicile in the UK. They must make themselves known to the residents. So we're talking about communication, and that's the key to this piece of legislation, is the level of communication on top of the actions that the responsible person or accountable person needs to do. So the residents need to know who is responsible for the buildings that they are, living in. The accountable person cannot be an organisation. It needs to be a named person. This ensures that ownership of responsibilities is known to all. And if at any point the responsible person hands over their responsibilities to another, there is even parts in the legislation that details what that changeover or handover steps need to be to ensure that there is a clean handover from one person to another. It also needs to ensure that the information is cascaded. We talked about high-risk buildings, but there are many occasions where a high-risk building has more than one person who will be deemed as responsible. For example, the ground floor could be commercial, where you've got domestic properties above. So you have a responsibility for different responsible people communicating with each other, and to ensure that anybody who is affected by the risk understands what that risk is, and also what the provisions for that risk assessments actually are. So again, we talk a lot more about the levels of communication throughout the entire structure. Also, there is a responsibility, or a requirement, should I say, to ensure that we have a fully documented list of safety information for that building throughout its entire lifespan. So we're talking about a cradle to grave scenario. So there needs to be a documented evidence that safety precautions and safety measures, levels of communication to residents, to other responsible people, are documented. For if there ever is a requirement for that information to be investigated or interrogated. And then finally, you've also got a requirement under a new Regulation 10 within the Fire Safety Order for regular or adequate inspections of certain aspects of a building. Next slide, please. Now, Regulation 10, can we go back one? Regulation 10 goes into the requirements, and I'm going to talk about fire safety doors at this stage. So the requirement, which is mandated, is that communal fire entrance doors are subject to a quarterly inspection. So 4 times a year, your communal entrance doors will need to be inspected. And it's quite a generic inspection criteria. We're talking about visible damage, alterations, air gaps, making sure that the doors close and lock, various things like that. Then we've got flat entrance doors. They're subject to an annual inspection. This is a little bit more detailed because we're now looking at ensuring that that door not is only fit for purpose, but it's not been changed or amended. So we're inspecting the flat entrance doors against the original specification of the doors as supplied. It's even gone into the details of looking at where means of escape is an important aspect. Should we be fitting key thumb turns to cylinders rather than key cylinders? So the level of inspection for the flat entrance doors is quite significant, even down to the point where if that entrance door has not got any records, understanding what the fixing methods are to the supporting construction. So that might mean removing architraves to have a look. Now, don't think for 1 minute that means that all fire doors are, because you've not got this evidence, won't be able to be inspected and all of a sudden have to be replaced. There is no requirement for remedial work to replace every single fire door out there. That is not the idea behind this piece of legislation. It's to ensure that we've got a robust inspection process for communal entrance doors and flat entrance doors. So, for example, there's even an element in there. So for door sets installed prior to 2021, there is a regulation out there, or a section out there, BS 8214, where the inspector can actually conduct an inspection against a door where they don't have a full level of the specification of the door. However, the important thing is that the results of all this must be cascaded again to residents or other responsible people within a shared premise. So there's quite, as we said, there's quite a lot of information here that landlords or responsible people will need to complete. Next slide, please. Who's policing it? Well, there's an organisation that's a branch of the HSE, referred to as a building safety regulator, and the building safety regulator has a number of powers that they're permitted to enforce. It could be correction, enforcement notices, or removal of non-compliant products, prosecutions of the responsible person or accountable person, issuing compliance and stop notices on building work, also removing the accountable person and implementing a corrective measures or special measures management team, and also the suspension or removal of building inspectors. So they have quite a lot of power out there, and they're the people that are going to be policing this moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we talked about this comes into force October the 1st. So there's no real lead-in period. This started on in April of this year. There's a lot of work for people to do, registering all the buildings with the regulator to ensure all their high-risk buildings. Again, please be aware we're talking about 11 meters and above. To register your buildings, to put actions in place to make sure that you've got adequate signage for your residents. Your residents understand exactly what's the risk that's associated with their buildings. Make sure that the accountable person's details are registered with a regulator and being communicated to occupants. Because a failure to comply with this can result in an unlimited fine and up to 2 years imprisonment. Having said that, this is not the end of it. One of the biggest things that the Home Office are working on is competence. And the next section that's coming in will be towards the end of this year, where they're looking at the competence of fire risk assessment providers. So that's expected to be published towards the end of this year, which will have I'm sure will have a lead-in period throughout next year. But the competence is a huge element that government are very aware of, because proving competence is a very difficult aspect or topic to actually deal with. So they've recently released some PAS documents for competence for building contractors, surveyors, architects, and this is going to continue moving forward. Competence is incredibly important. Next slide, please. Just to prove that things are moving on, this is a document that's currently out for consultation. This is the draft fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats. And I've pulled out an extract here because we're a big advocate of third-party certification. And proving compliance is very difficult without reams and reams of paper, lots and lots of documentation. But section 54.3 really does spell out the best way of demonstrating compliance, which is through third-party schemes. Those of you who have got access to third-party schemes, mitigated a lot of responsibility. Those who don't, whilst it's not the only way to prove competence, it is the most recognised way of proving competence. This document is currently out for consultation. I'd strongly advise anybody who looks after buildings at this consultation period, because it's for public consultation now, so you do all have access to seeing this document. It's quite a large document, as I'm sure you can imagine, but it's a really well thought out document. Ultimately, this will come out as yet another level of, or another layer of guidance for responsible people, but it does help you with what's being asked for, because we all know that guidance is literally guidance, where approved codes of practice are the most appropriate way of adhering to a piece of legislation, but guidance gives you a very strong base to work from. Next slide, please. So I know I've talked quite a bit. So responsible persons or accountable people. So what we've done is we've produced a small checklist that's available, as Peter's quite rightly said, via this event. Also, it's available via the Vincast website. So if you could just put me the slide up quickly. Again, it's just a little tick box exercise, but it's telling you, or it's asking you, can you answer all these questions? Have you completed all these activities? If you want any more help, please feel free to ask for it. But again, you've got a list of questions there that you can work your way through and look at your own organisations and look at where you are with your particular activities. Does it affect you? Does it not affect you? Are you prepared? Do you need to do any more work? Have you got any gaps? Have you got anything missing that you need to work on? And it's just there to give you some assistance, a baseline to work from, if you like. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. And to answer the many questions that we had, you will get slides. As a categorical yes, as I said at the start. The slides that we use today will be circulated to participants. So we're moving now on from Mark to our second speaker. We're very lucky to be joined by Stephanie from 13 Group. Stephanie Kelly, she's Buildings Operations Manager at 13 Group in the northeast of England. Steph leads 13's team of building safety and compliance specialists who are responsible for keeping residents, buildings, colleagues and the organisation safe. She is a board member for the Chartered Institute of Housing Northeast and Women in Social Housing Northeast. I will just say, just briefly before I hand over to Steph, there were obviously loads of questions coming in on the chat, which is great. Please do keep them coming in. I will move to Q&A at the end after all of our speakers have said their piece. There are a couple of technical issues. Some people asked about some of the things Mark said and queried some parts of it. I have asked further speakers who are coming on to address some of those issues, but do keep the questions coming in. It will be good to have a good debate at the end. But without further ado, over to you, Stephanie, to tell us about your organisation and what providers need to be doing.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. So I was asked with just giving you a little bit of an overview, really, of what 13's approach has been, how we've set about getting ourselves structured and set up for the new regulatory reform and landscape, and then just really any lessons that we've learned along the way. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so if you just bear with me. So just a bit of an introduction to the team. So as Peter said, I look after building safety and what we call quality compliance at 13. So the building safety team consists of a building safety manager. We've got building safety specialists, fire safety specialists, which are a team of our in-house FRA officers. We have got building safety operatives there, a team of in-house joiners, and we've also got fire door specialists. So we've got a team of internal fire door qualified certifiers and installers, the BM Trada qualified. And I'm going to come on and touch on a little bit of why we've taken the decision to have quite a lot of the specialists within the team. Then on the other side, I've got quality compliance. So within quality compliance, I've got a manager who looks after service level agreements and really has responsibility for managing the golden thread of information. She also looks after the clerk of works and CDM team, and a couple of technicians within the team as well. So it's a really, both teams are really specialised and they both work really closely together. They've both been critical in helping us to get to where we are today. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. We were actually in a position where we'd started to look at fire safety in advance of Grenfell, as I'm sure a lot of housing associations with larger stock portfolios had. We actually interviewed Les, who's one of the fire safety specialists, on the day after Grenfell. Now, historically, FRAs and fire safety sat within our health and safety team. However, a decision was made corporately to take that out of that function and to sit it separately within a building safety team, predominantly to add a bit of an extra layer of assurance, and that being that we're actually audited internally now by our health and safety team, in addition to external audits. So like I said, there is that extra level of critique and assurance. We also took the step that of taking a lot of the in-house teams, just so that we could manage the competency, we could track competency. And again, I'm going to touch on some of that a little bit later. So in terms of getting ready for regulation, what are the things we did? Well, you'll all remember the Hackett report, when that was first issued, came with a vast array of recommendations. So what we did was we looked at them, we did a bit of a gap analysis and we scored ourselves basically on where we were in relation to those actions and recommendations, set about an action plan. And that was really the basis of trying to get us regulatory ready. We knew that the legislation was going to come. We wanted to be a little bit prepared. We had a lot of work to do with board in terms of getting us structured and set up and being able to deliver some of what we've done today. We've introduced what we call a complex building matrix. And I think what's really important is obviously the building safety regulator for this period in time is predominantly, well, is only concerned with high-risk residential buildings 18 metres and above. However, as I'm sure loads of you on the call will attest to, they're not always the buildings that cause us the most concern. So what because, you know, the level of scrutiny that they get, the level of attention and all of the safety systems and detection systems and whatnot that we've got in them. So we've developed a complex buildings matrix internally. So that includes every building, every single building. We've got about 750, I think, that we do FRAs on. Has been scored and ranked in a matrix, and it makes sure that that building gets the appropriate level of attention. So it determines the frequency of the FRA that we give, and we do in advance of LGA guidance. So if the LGA guidance says do it annually, we do it every 6 months. 2 years, we do it annually. Get the gist. It also allows us to move buildings. We've ranked them, like I say, so we go HRB 1 down to high risk building 6, different categories, and it allows us to focus our attentions on where we think investment might be needed. So it's about integration into a wider conversation in investment plans, and I think that that's really important for the regulator, because they're going to want to see how you're managing risk, how you're managing the building risk, not always about what's in your building safety case file and the current documentation. It's about what's your projected look forward, how you continuously apportioning the right level of attention. So we've done that. We've compiled safety case reports. So we used a template which some of our peers had worked with the building safety regulator to develop. And again, in the compilation of those, did a gap analysis. So what information were we really struggling to find? What did we know that we did, but that we couldn't physically, tangibly evidence? You know, if you can't sort of put your hands on it within 10 minutes, you're going to struggle to justify to the regulator that you've got a handle on it. So we started doing a bit of a gap analysis on that, and identified where there were gaps in data or where there was gaps in knowledge. So as a result of that, we've commissioned a few reports in terms of what do we know about the structural integrity of the building, what do we know about the facades, condition reports, those types of things, and started on getting, obviously we were missing quite a lot of as-built drawings because we're an association that's done quite a few mergers, so trying to get some BIM modelling done. We use a database called C365, which is a compliance database, and that manages and prompts all of our compliance programs, but it also manages and tracks the actions attributed to them. So we, all of our FRA actions are logged on there, and they're tracked. They go into an active Power BI dashboard that we can see daily to see if anything's going to fall off the radar. And board wanted us to do 100% post inspections on all our FRA actions. It's not all physical inspections. Some of it is a desktop exercise. So, for example, if we replaced a door set, we know if we get the certification through from Interseal, who was one of our contractors, because we do use a contractor as well to support the in-house team, that we can check off to say, yeah, we've received that certification. It meets our checks. That can be filed away. We can mark off that action, and that's about closing that loop all the way along. So we're working really hard to digitalise. We're not 100% there yet. I'm not going to say otherwise, but I think we've made great progress in terms of having full compliance visibility across certainly the big sort of 6 or 7, like asbestos, you know, Legionella, lifts, fire, those types of things, gas and electric. Other component parts, some of the M&E things, we're in the process of moving over onto a digital database. Talked about the dashboards. They, like I say, they're a real-time live information, and again, that was a request of sort of leadership and board to give visibility and transparency. And we talked to the customers about what they would like to see in relation to reporting, and we've included that within those dashboards. The clerks of works also inspect repairs that we have taken out. We had an incident a couple of years ago whereby we'd had a fire in one of the bin rooms, and we'd had some smoke damage on one of the floors, and what had later transpired is that some work had taken place to the bin chutes, the openings, and the repairs operatives just hadn't fire stopped appropriately, hadn't realised. So with that in mind, we realised that there was a need to really manage and maintain that. So the clerk of works now we do internal permits. It's an internal licence to work. So the trades who work on our high risk buildings, they have to work under a licence, and external trades work under a permit, and we will post inspect their work to make sure that the building's fire safety hasn't been compromised during the works. It's particularly important for us at the minute. I don't know if anyone else is finding this, but we're being hit by a lot of infrastructure companies wanting to come and install fibre on the building. We're having to really work hard with them to make sure that they meet our specification and standards for integration. Again, it's about logging. So what for us, it was around logging the footfall. How can we evidence the amount of attention that a building gets? And if I tell you that one of our high-rise buildings gets in excess of 900 visits per year, so that's not just service visits, but that's our building safety operatives and high-rise champions going twice a day. That's the building safety team going. That's, you know, your quarterly fire door inspections, your monthly fire checks on your firefighting safety equipment, and all of these records and logs need to be recorded somewhere. You've got to evidence where you've been, what you've touched, and who's done, and the competency of that person. So we're logging that. In terms of the competency, we've implemented a competency framework. We started with the building safety team, so all of the team have been through the framework metrics, and so we've scored them, and we've also had to evidence how we feel that they are either competent or what they need to work towards for further assurance of competency. So we've implemented that. And then finally, just sort of wanted to touch on a little bit of the resident engagement lessons we've learned around. We've got a really good link with our involved building safety group. They help us tremendously and have recently helped in producing the resident engagement strategies. So you've got to have a bespoke resident engagement strategy for each of your high risk buildings. So we did a feeling of safety questionnaire with residents of those buildings and asked them what they would like to know, what information is really important for them in their building, and how safe do they feel? Do they know who to contact? Do they know what to do in the event of a fire? And that's helped us formulate the documents that we're about to issue. And within those documents, we outline really clearly who at 13 is responsible for what you can expect from us, and how to hold us to account. So if you're not comfortable, because obviously one of the recommendations that fell out of the Grenfell issue was around accountability and people being held to account. So all that's documented in the bespoke resident engagement strategies. And again, everything that we've spoken about in terms of the responsible person, accountable person, we've had all that documented at board, so we can tangibly say to the regulator, here's our evidence of, you know, the appointment of that responsible person for that particular aspect. I think what's been made abundantly clear for me is that the need to really evidence everything. And we've obviously embarked this week on registering our buildings, and we did it we went through all of the questions and we put it on a big spreadsheet initially to see if we had any gaps. And for every tick box or, you know, cross that we put in, it was like, how are we evidencing that? What, you know, so if we're questioned on it, where would we go for the evidence and who's responsible for that? And that was a really key and valuable piece of work that we've just done. So I'd recommend others maybe thinking about doing the same. In terms of some lessons, and I'll wrap up quickly because I'm just aware of time, but in terms of lessons for us, I think FRA actions, so some of the initial audits that we had done, it's around being able to track fully our compliance against them. So it's not just good enough to sort of say, yep, I've raised that action. It has that action being closed down and completed, and was the job done satisfactorily? And are residents aware of the FRA actions that you're logging? Do they know how their building is performing? That was one of the lessons. Again, competency. I think there was a general perception, right? Okay, you've got a building safety team, you've got a CDM team. I don't need to worry about that anymore. We've had to do sort of a big awareness raising across the business around it being an eyes wide open approach. If you work in these buildings, you have a duty of care. And around working with our colleagues in repairs and maintenance around what do's and don'ts really, and what they can and can't touch, and you know, not to scare them off touching things, but just knowing how to approach repairs in these complex buildings. Again, competency and due diligence with procurement. We've worked hard on our procurement framework to make sure that we're asking the right questions of those who are joining us, you know, from consultants to we have a few third-party repairs teams who work with us, sort of like Vision and into sales, so making sure that we're doing due diligence about the people who they're employing. Gap analysis has been really key for us in identifying where we had gaps and what we needed to do. Record keeping for us, so we're in the process of developing a SharePoint, what we're calling building safety knowledge hub. So that's going to be accessible for everybody across the building, so essentially the business, sorry. So essentially they'll go into that building, they'll be able to see, type in the name and see everything in relation to that building. And I think just, you know, lastly, it's around collaborative working for us and the rest of the business, because we identified that we couldn't really just do this alone in terms of record keeping. So yeah, I appreciate I probably covered quite a lot there, but there was quite a lot to cover in the last of the 6 years. So if anyone wants to ask any questions afterwards, please shout.
We will hopefully have time for some questions. Stephanie, thank you for sharing so many of your insights and being so generous with the experience you've had at your organisation. We do have Amanda on the line now. I'm pleased to say. So Amanda, I don't know if you heard me at the start, but I already introduced you to our audience, so I won't do it again. But just to remind anybody who's forgotten, Amanda is a bona fide expert in this area, a partner at Trowers and Hamlins, somebody who advises executive teams and boards on this issue and similar issues. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Amanda. And just a reminder, the question and answer session we will do is at the end. So please keep those questions coming in, although we have many already. So Amanda, or the stage is yours. Amanda, I'm afraid you're on mute there. I think you're still on mute. If you click the unmute button, it should bring you online. I don't know if any of our technical team can assist Amanda here in manually unmuting her. Oh, I think you're unmuted, Amanda.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't get at it on my screen. Sorry, good afternoon, everybody, and apologies for the technical difficulties I seem to be experiencing. I do a lot of talking to people online and in person, and I don't normally have this trouble. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to go fairly short because I'm conscious there's a lot of questions and it might be better to be interactive. But essentially, the sort of message I want to convey is that this subject is vast, and there's been a huge amount of legislation and detail, most of which has come really late in the day for people to get to grips with. But those of you who have been tracking this for years will know Dame Judith Hackett said, don't wait for legislation, get ready, get organised. And obviously we've heard from 13 Group that they have spent the last 6 years getting organised and getting ready. And that is my message to you. I suspect many of the people on this call are already up to speed, which is why you're here to check you've got everything. But focus on managing the risk and working out how you can manage the risk, and don't get too hung up on the detail because the detail has arrived so late. So the first pinch point that we're facing is this registration of buildings, which has got to be done, high risk buildings, which has got to be done by the weekend. But if you've not got all the information ready to do that, just get something onto the system, as in just go on and register the basics. The way the system works is it asks you specific questions, then you put the information in, move to the next screen. If you haven't got the information, you can skip it. So put something on and get the process started. One of the questions that has been raised in the chat, which I've been asked to address, is this point about the accountable person or principal accountable person, who is the body that will be registering. That entity is normally going to be a legal company or entity. It's not going to be an individual. So we're not talking about personal liability for the principal accountable person. Where the confusion has arisen, I think, is that the system with the regulator that requires you to put on a nominated person, i.e. a named contact for that entity that is representing the principal accountable person. And that's as much for communication purposes with the regulator. The regulator needs to contact somebody within the legal entity that is the principal accountable person. They've got a name contact. So I think it be very clear, companies will typically be the principal accountable person and accountable persons, unless the business that is in effect occupying the space or in control of the space is a one-man band, when it will be an individual. But don't get hung up on an individual. There is potentially under the Building Safety Act, the potential for personal liability, as there is under all the main statutes under the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is very much, if you do something that is above and beyond what your peers are doing, if you lie or if you do something really extraordinary, there is the risk of personal liability. But generally speaking, doing your job as part of a company, that is not going to incur for you personal liability, even if you're the chief exec or the senior sort of finance director or whatever. It's not. So try not to worry too much about it. Focus on the big picture, which is managing the risk and keeping people safe in their homes. And as Stephanie has said, engaging with them and ensuring that they are comfortable with what you're doing in as far as you can. So very much, there is an awful lot of legislation here. There's a lot of detail, but look at the big picture and do what you can. And I think one of the other questions that's been raised is this point about, do you have 28 days from when you submitted your initial registration to put on the key building information? 28 days, I think, the way the legislation was drafted, was it presumed that would be on before the 30th of September. So for people who were registering their buildings back in April or May when it first opened, you'd still got 28 days in which to put the full detail. If you're right up against the deadline, i.e. now, and you're registering, you haven't got 28 days. So in theory, it ought to go on now. But I think the reality is, as I've said, get your initial registration on. If subsequent information has to follow, that's fine. The regulator would rather you engaged with the process and started the process, and it wasn't fully completed in terms of information, than you don't do it at all. So don't wait until you've got everything tickety-boo. Just get something on the system and start the ball rolling. So that would be my advice. So I'm not going to say anything further now, because I think we want to have a bit of a Q&A. I will remain unmuted because I seem to struggle with that, but I won't speak until spoken to. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Amanda. And you're quite right, we do have a lot of questions, and I am going to apologise at the outset, because there is absolutely no way, even if we did one a minute between here and 1 o'clock, we would get through all of them. But I think one of the ones that has come up several times, and I think this will be straight back to you, Amanda, but I may also hear from Mark on this if he's got anything to add. If you are a provider who has no buildings above 18 metres, or if you're a provider who has lots of buildings below 18 metres, can we talk a little bit about what needs to be done for these non-high-rise buildings under this new act? What changes, if anything? So, Amanda, do you want to take that one first of all, because we've had several people ask it?
Well, initially, you've got all sorts of building regulation is now under the building safety regulator. So in a sense, there is a different regulator for all building regs applications. I think the reality is a lot of the people that you were using will still be the same people. So local authority teams have still got that responsibility. Where there were approved inspectors, they have to register, and so in theory could still be the same inspectors. So that regime affects everybody. Mark has talked about the requirement to do regular safety checks of your fire doors, both your communal doors and your individual flat front doors, in buildings up 11 metres or higher. So that's sort of 4 or 5 stories. Those buildings are caught by that regime, so the requirement to do regular inspections. And so if you've got a higher risk building, it all applies to you. But the next level down of buildings that are sort of 5 stories, 11 metres up, then you've got the sort of inspection regime and sort of general resident engagement regimes applying to you. So essentially, there's something in it for everybody.
And Amanda, I'm going to stay with you just to clarify a technical point, which again has been asked by numerous people. Can you just explain about the accountable person and who they have to be? There seems to be some confusion in our chat about whether it's an individual or an organisation, whether housing associations have to register and address, all of that sort of stuff. Can you give us your pithiest summary of what the requirements are for the accountable person?
Okay, so your accountable person will be somebody who either has control of the common part, like a legalist, like interest, like as in owns part of the common parts, or so that's sort of building owners, long leaseholders, etc. Or it will be the entity who has under a contract, and that is a lease, not just any old like management agreement, who has control of those parts. So in certain circumstances, you'll have managing agents, but only where they are part of the, they've got a leasehold interest. So where you've got a management company, they will probably be under a lease, so they will have a relevant repairing obligation. But it's sort of, you're looking at ownership in the first instance, ownership and control, and you're looking at a contractual arrangement, but it has to be a lease that brings you into that, gives you that status, not just a management agreement. And I think I've already said it's about companies, entities. It's not about individual people.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for clarifying that, Amanda. And Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you here. There's again, several people have asked this question or a similar one. But how do you plan to share the compliance data and FRA actions with residents? And there's been questions also sort of on that topic, being a similar theme. Just how generally do you communicate your FRA actions with residents? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that, both from a kind of messaging perspective, but also from what requirements you have to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had a lot of debate internally about this, to be fair, because in my opinion, the FRA is a little bit like an MOT. It's a moment in time inspection, so you could drive a car away from the forecourt, the wheel could fall off. So what we want to try and do is manage how the risks are perceived, because reading an FRA document could be potentially quite scary. So work with residents to understand what they want to know. So firstly, we now do standalone building safety resident engagement meetings with the residents within the block. So before we used to tag along to the tenancy management ones. We now do standalone, and that gives us the opportunity to talk about the FRA, to talk about the approach taken by the team. And what we decide to talk about is not, we've educated residents so that they know the likelihood is when we come and do the FRA, we're going to find issues with the door. That's fine. It doesn't necessarily cause you any great concern. But when we're talking about notifiable reporting occurrences, so the things that you're now required to report to the building safety regulator potentially, or to the local fire authority, those are the types of things that we will actively push a communication method out to the customers. So for argument's sake, all of your AOV systems fail in your building, that would probably be something we would want to directly communicate with the residents and let them know, we've identified this issue, we're not going to be able to resolve it overnight, this is our plan for doing it, to offer some levels of assurancy. So at the minute we publish all of the FRAs, or we're going to be publishing, we do it for the high rise at the minute. We're starting to look at how we can do that for our other portfolio of properties. So in next tranche will probably be the 11 to 18 metres and then 11 metres and below. We've also got digital screens in the high-rise blocks, so we share some information on those around, did you know we visited your building this week and we've identified this. So I think it's an ongoing dialogue, and what we found was when we did the feeling of safety questionnaires, it was really interesting that some blocks wanted a plethora of information. They wanted to know everything about their building, and others just said, we just want an overarching statement from you telling me everything's all right. So I don't necessarily think you can do a one size fits all. It's about offering a range of engagement opportunities for residents.
Thank you, Stephanie. Mark, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to throw you a sort of a combined set of several questions about fire doors, and you can kind of pick them up as you want. But there's a few questions in here, and Amanda, you might want to come on this, but I'll come to Mark first, about the both the responsibilities of leaseholders under this new regime, and I suppose that covers access and maintenance of the doors as well, but also whether or not the repairs can and should be recharged to leaseholders. And second, like I say, I'm going to bundle a couple of these questions up together. We've got quite an interesting question from a guy from Pennington Choices, who said that there's large portfolios of properties, many thousands of doors, teams that are reducing in size and dwindling budgets. What innovative solutions have clients used to stay on top of this requirement, particularly for the quarterly check of communal doors? Is there technology out there that can help people do this?
Yeah.
So I'll let you take those two. There's another doors question that I'll come back to you with, but do you want to give your thoughts on those two first?
Technology is really becoming very popular. I mean, again, it's all down to individual fire door providers to ensure that even the technology that's contained within the door has to be tested to ensure that that's not offering any integrity issues with the door. So there are a lot of data pins, for example, that are available that store all the information on a cloud. So the best way, the most reliable way of doing this, assuming that everybody's got access to that sort of technology, is first of all your fabricator would record the specification of the door, and that information or that link is recorded on a data pin on the door. When the door is then installed, the installation team can record everything that they've done to install that door set on the data pin, so that you lose the requirement to having lots and lots of documentation because it's all stored electronically. And then when it comes round to, when it comes to the inspection process, the inspection team need first of all to know what is the spec of the door as supplied, and then how was it installed. So if that information is available on the actual door set, and that door set's got a reference, so they can go around and they'll scan the data pin, bring up the information. It can bring up when it was last inspected. It can bring up when any maintenance was done on it. It can bring up when it was when it was installed and what the specification of the door was. So that technology really does speed up that process. It also means that the inspection team are making best value of their time, because the information is there and accurate, and there's no risk of it being lost or altered in any way, shape or form. I mean, it's something that we really strongly recommend, and as a systems house, we've ensured that that sort of technology is available within the range of, or the scope of the product. So, and it's also something that can be added retrospectively as well. So a lot of the door sets out there within their scopes allow for that sort of information. So even though the door set may not have been provided with technology such as that, and there are other ways of doing this, it can be added retrospectively. So you can then, as a landlord or a responsible person, you can ensure that all that information is accumulated together and stored. So it cuts down on a lot of the process. You're muted, Peter.
Sorry, everyone. I had the chat box open over my mute button. Amanda, do you want to pick up the elements around leaseholder responsibilities under the Act for fire doors, particularly, so the Fire Safety Act, and issues of recharging and that kind of thing? How should providers manage their relationships with leaseholders and shared owners and that sort of thing in this area?
I think this is really an interesting and quite challenging point, because the legislation has sort of gone halfway towards making leaseholders directly responsible, but it's changed the ground rules. It always was the case that if you as a landlord had demised a flat front door to a tenant or a long leaseholder, you could have no responsibility for it because it was no longer in your ownership. That has always been a problem, where you've got to upgrade the doors. This new legislation makes it very clear that those doors are part of the common parts, but it doesn't actually go as far as changing the sort of law of property, if you like, in as far as where they've already been demised. What do you do about that? The sort of one sort of thing on the other side of the coin is that there is now an obligation under the Building Safety Act to cooperate, and so therefore, if you as a resident or a long leaseholder have a door which is demised to you, but the landlord has these responsibilities that Mark's just been discussing for safety checks, then you need to cooperate with your landlord. So I think that what we're looking at is where you don't get cooperation from tenants or long leaseholders, owners will be able to go to court, much as they do for gas safety check injunctions, and actually get in that way. Now that is a pain, and in theory there is this duty to cooperate, but I think we have moved the goalposts a bit, but we're still not actually there, because we've got no clear obligation where you don't, as landowner, own those flat front doors to do works on them if you've got a tenant or leaseholder that's not cooperating.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to come back to you, Stephanie, with an interesting question about how you've approached quality monitoring of the repairs and maintenance trades. The question is, are all trades trained appropriately, or do they have a set, or do 13 Group have a set repairs and maintenance team that covers buildings with communal areas? Such a huge issue in the sort of maintenance and keeping compartmentation secure is people coming in and doing works to the buildings. You've got 2 minutes.
Yes,
so what thoughts do you have on that?
So still a work in progress, but as I alluded to, we've issued what we call a license to work for our internal repairs teams, and that requires the repairs and maintenance managers to show that they've done due diligence and competency checks. So we would expect that the trade just fresh on the tools would not be working in one of our high-rise residential buildings alone, and would have gone through our building safety training. So we do a bit of a welcome to building safety. This is some of the do's and don'ts. This is what you're looking out for in a building. These are what our high-risk buildings are. This is what a fire door looks like. This is what we would expect you to be doing in terms of a repair. Our internal teams are not allowed to do obviously door installations, as you would imagine. They can fit the door blank if it's like out of hours, and the team will go the next day to rectify that. But in terms of the work that they do, it gets logged on our system, and it will prompt a visit from the clerk of works once the job is complete for them to sign it off to check that nothing's been compromised.
That's terrific, Stephanie. Thank you. You did that in less than 2 minutes. I'm actually going to grab one last question. I think this is quite a straightforward one, but an important one, which I'm going to come to Mark with. one of the attendees at the webinar has said that they feel that I agree with this. I think there's some confusion for checks and inspections for buildings under 11 metres, and people thinking that the new regulations mean that doors under 11 metres don't need an inspection. Now, I don't think that that's right. I think that I agree with that audience member who says that I interpret the regs to say that they still require inspection, but frequency and scope is not prescriptive, unlike the buildings above 11 metres where they are now subject to this prescriptive regime. So Mark, do you just want to clear up that confusion for anyone on the call? For buildings below 11 metres with communal parts, with fire doors, what are the inspection responsibilities for a building owner?
The inspection, I mean, okay, so phase 3 specifically deals with a particular type of building, but the Fire Safety Act has inspection's been there for a little while. So, you know, I think Amanda mentioned this earlier, that you're quite right, that, you know, whilst 18 metres and above have this very prescriptive inspection criteria, there's still the inspection criteria for all of the buildings below 18 metres. So 11 metres still need the annual inspection on the flat entrance doors. That's not changed. That's been in place for quite a while. So again, to pick up on what Dame Hackett said, don't wait for legislation. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're in control and you understand the safety requirements of all your buildings.
Yeah. I mean, I think you know, the regulatory reform order is all of these buildings, and those rules still apply if you haven't added new ones on for a particular height category. Not like we're taking things away, is it? Right. Look, we're 1 minute past the time when we were meant to finish, so I will wrap up there and let everyone go and get their lunch. I do hope this has been a helpful session for everyone. There's an awful lot of information, new responsibilities coming in, but thank you for attending, and a big thank you to Mark, Stephanie and Amanda for taking their time out and being so generous in sharing their thoughts and insights with everyone. So this will be shared, slides will be shared. Please keep coming along to our webinars, and thank you all for attending. If we were all together, I'd ask you to applaud, but please applaud where you're sitting, and hopefully the spirit of it will reach our speakers. But thank you all for coming along. Take care.